What if I told you that for nearly 2,000 years, one of the most profound questions in Christian history has been whispered in shadows, preserved in fragments, and carried forward by communities who refuse to let certain memories die? Tonight, we're going to explore a question that academic researchers have grappled with for decades, yet remains largely unknown to the general public. It's a question that emerges from ancient manuscripts, preserved traditions, and archaeological discoveries that suggest our understanding of early Christianity might be far more complex than we've been taught. The question is this: if Jesus of Nazareth and Mary Magdalene had descendants, what happened to that lineage? And more specifically, what name has been preserved in the historical record for their alleged daughter? Now, before we go any further, let me be absolutely clear about our approach tonight. We're not here to attack anyone's faith or to promote conspiracy theories. Instead, we're going to examine this question through the lens of serious historical inquiry, looking at manuscript evidence, preserved traditions, and scholarly research that has been conducted by respected academics for generations. The reality is that the early Christian period was far more diverse and complex than many people realize. Historical evidence suggests that various Christian communities preserved different traditions, different texts, and different understandings of key figures like Mary Magdalene. Some of these traditions were eventually incorporated into canonical Christianity, while others were preserved by communities that existed on the margins of institutional power. What makes this particular question so compelling is not just the historical intrigue, but the way it illuminates broader questions about how historical narratives are constructed, preserved, and sometimes obscured. When we ask about the alleged daughter of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, we're really asking about how memory works, how traditions survive, and how different communities have understood the sacred across centuries. Academic research in this area draws from multiple disciplines: manuscript studies, archaeology, anthropology, and comparative religion. Scholars have examined Gnostic texts discovered in places like Nag Hammadi, analyzed medieval traditions preserved in various European communities, and studied the oral histories of groups that claim to carry ancient memories. What emerges from this research is not a simple answer, but rather a complex web of traditions, symbols, and names that have been preserved across different cultures and time periods. Some of these traditions point to a figure known in various contexts as Sarah, sometimes called Sarah the Black, Sarah la Kali, or Sarah the Egyptian. But here's what makes this academically fascinating. The figure of Sarah appears in multiple, seemingly unconnected historical contexts. She appears in traditions preserved by Romani communities in southern France. She shows up in certain Gnostic texts that were excluded from the biblical canon. She's referenced in medieval legends that were preserved by various mystical traditions throughout Europe. The question isn't whether these traditions are historically accurate in a literal sense. That's something we may never be able to determine with absolute certainty. The question is what these preserved traditions tell us about early Christian diversity, about the role of women in early Christian communities, and about the kinds of stories that certain groups found important enough to preserve across centuries of persecution and marginalization. What we're going to explore tonight is how serious scholars have approached these questions, what evidence they've examined, and what conclusions they've drawn. We'll look at the methodologies used to study these traditions, the debates within academic circles, and the broader implications of these inquiries for our understanding of Christian history. This isn't about proving or disproving anyone's religious beliefs. It's about expanding our understanding of the rich, complex, and often surprising history of early Christianity. It's about recognizing that the Christianity we know today emerged from a much more diverse and dynamic early period than many people realize. So as we begin this exploration, I invite you to approach these questions with both scholarly rigor and open curiosity. We're going to examine evidence, consider multiple perspectives, and engage with research that has been conducted by serious academics working within established institutions and methodologies. The story we're about to unfold isn't simple, and it doesn't offer easy answers, but it does offer us an opportunity to deepen our understanding of how spiritual traditions develop, how historical memory operates, and how questions that seem revolutionary today have actually been discussed by scholars for generations. Are you ready to explore what might be one of the most intriguing questions in Christian historical research? Let's begin this scholarly journey together. When we examine the canonical New Testament, one of the most striking features is what's missing rather than what's present. We have relatively little information about the personal relationships of Jesus, the everyday lives of his followers, or what happened to many key figures after the crucifixion. This silence becomes particularly pronounced when we consider the women who were central to Jesus' ministry. While the Gospels make it clear that women played crucial roles, funding his ministry, following him from Galilee, remaining present at the crucifixion when many male disciples had fled, and being the first witnesses to the resurrection, the canonical texts provide surprisingly little detail about their subsequent lives and activities. Mary Magdalene presents perhaps the most intriguing case. The canonical Gospels establish her as a central figure. She's mentioned by name more than most of the 12 apostles. She's consistently portrayed as being present at crucial moments, and she's given the extraordinary role of being the first witness to the resurrection, what early Christians called the apostle to the apostles. Yet after the resurrection accounts, Mary Magdalene virtually disappears from the canonical record. This absence becomes even more striking when we consider that early Christian communities clearly continued to venerate her memory, as evidenced by the numerous non-canonical texts that bear her name and the traditions that developed around her figure. Historical research suggests that this pattern of presence followed by absence may reflect the complex political and theological dynamics of early Christianity. As institutional Christianity developed and consolidated power, certain voices and traditions may have been marginalized or excluded from official narratives. This is where the question of preserved traditions becomes academically significant. When official records are silent or incomplete, historians often turn to alternative sources, oral traditions, archaeological evidence, and texts that were preserved outside of official channels. In the case of Mary Magdalene and the question of potential descendants, several types of evidence have attracted scholarly attention. First, there are the Gnostic texts discovered in the 20th century, which present Mary Magdalene in a very different light than the canonical Gospels. These texts, while clearly representing later theological developments, may preserve some memory of earlier traditions about her role and significance. Second, there are the various traditions preserved by communities throughout Europe, particularly in regions that claim direct historical connections to early Christian figures. These traditions, while often mixed with legendary elements, sometimes contain historical details that can be verified through other sources. Third, there are archaeological discoveries that have provided new insights into the diversity of early Christian communities and the roles that women played in these communities. These discoveries have helped scholars understand that early Christianity was far more varied in its practices and beliefs than the eventual canonical tradition suggests. What emerges from this research is a picture of early Christianity as a diverse movement with multiple centers, various theological perspectives, and different understandings of key figures and events. In this context, the possibility that some communities preserve traditions about Mary Magdalene's life after the resurrection, including traditions about potential family relationships, becomes historically plausible, even if it remains difficult to verify. The academic approach to these questions requires careful methodology. Scholars distinguish between different types of evidence and different levels of historical certainty. They examine how traditions develop over time, how they're influenced by later theological and political concerns, and how they might preserve genuine historical memories alongside legendary elements. Before we dive deeper into these preserved traditions, consider this. If you're seeking knowledge that goes beyond surface narratives, this channel commits to scholarly exploration of hidden histories. Subscribe not just for this journey, but because understanding our spiritual heritage requires dedicated investigation. What we're about to explore has been studied by serious researchers for decades, and approaching these questions with academic rigor requires ongoing commitment to evidence-based inquiry. The silence in the canonical record about Mary Magdalene's later life creates space for questions that have intrigued scholars for generations. As we'll see, some of these questions have led researchers to examine traditions that suggest this silence may not be accidental, and that some communities may have preserved memories that complement and complicate our understanding of early Christian history. The discovery of ancient manuscripts in the 20th century revolutionized our understanding of early Christianity's diversity. The most famous of these discoveries occurred in 1945 near the town of Nag Hammadi in Egypt. where a collection of Gnostic texts was found that had been hidden for over 16 centuries. Among these texts were several that presented Mary Magdalene in a radically different light than the canonical Gospels. The Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Philip, and the Dialogue of the Savior all portray her as a prominent disciple with special insight into Jesus' teachings. While these texts were clearly written later than the canonical Gospels and reflect developed theological positions, they demonstrate that some early Christian communities held very different views about Mary Magdalene's role and significance. The Gospel of Philip, in particular, has attracted scholarly attention because of its references to Mary Magdalene's relationship with Jesus. The text contains passages that some scholars interpret as suggesting an intimate relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene, though the fragmentary nature of the manuscript makes definitive interpretation challenging. More significant for our current inquiry are references in some of these texts to the continuation of Jesus' lineage. While these references are often symbolic or metaphorical rather than literal, they indicate that at least some early Christian communities were comfortable with the idea that Jesus' spiritual legacy might have been preserved through family relationships as well as through institutional structures. The academic study of these manuscripts requires sophisticated methodological approaches. Scholars must consider the dating of the texts, their relationship to earlier traditions, their theological contexts, and their historical reliability. Most specialists in early Christianity emphasize that these texts reflect the theological concerns of the communities that produced them, rather than providing direct historical evidence about the lives of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. However, the existence of these alternative traditions does suggest that early Christianity was more diverse in its understandings of key figures and relationships than the canonical tradition alone would indicate. This diversity creates space for scholarly investigation into traditions that may have been preserved outside of official channels. Beyond the Nag Hammadi discoveries, researchers have examined other manuscript traditions that contain references to the continuation of Jesus' lineage. Some medieval texts, while clearly legendary in many respects, appear to preserve traditions that may have earlier origins. These texts often focus on the preservation of sacred bloodlines and the migration of early Christian figures to various parts of Europe. The methodological challenge in studying these texts is distinguishing between later legendary accretions and potentially earlier historical memories. Scholars use various techniques to make these distinctions: linguistic analysis to identify earlier and later textual layers, comparison with independently verified historical information, and analysis of how traditions develop and change over time. One pattern that emerges from this research is the recurring appearance of certain names and locations across different manuscript traditions. The name Sarah, in particular, appears in various contexts that suggest it may have been associated with early Christian traditions about Mary Magdalene and her potential descendants. In some Gnostic texts, Sarah appears as a figure associated with divine wisdom and spiritual insight. In certain medieval legends, Sarah is portrayed as a key figure in the preservation of sacred traditions. In Romani cultural traditions, Sara Lăcalia is venerated as a saint with connections to early Christian history. While these appearances of the name Sarah across different traditions don't constitute proof of historical connection, they do suggest patterns that have attracted scholarly attention. The academic approach to such patterns involves careful analysis of how traditions migrate between different communities, how names and symbols acquire significance in different cultural contexts, and how historical memories might be preserved in various forms. The manuscript evidence also reveals the complex relationship between institutional Christianity and alternative traditions. Many of the texts that contain references to Mary Magdalene's continued significance were preserved by communities that existed on the margins of official Christianity. This marginalization may have allowed these communities to preserve traditions that were less acceptable to institutional authorities. Archaeological evidence has complemented the manuscript discoveries by providing material evidence for the diversity of early Christian communities. Excavations at early Christian sites have revealed that women held prominent roles in many communities, that different communities had different theological emphases, and that the process of Christian institutionalization was gradual and varied across different regions. The archaeological record also provides evidence for the migration patterns of early Christian communities. Some scholars have traced possible routes by which early Christian figures might have traveled to various parts of the Roman Empire and beyond. These studies suggest that the preservation of alternative traditions in places like southern France might have historical plausibility, even if specific details remain difficult to verify. What the manuscript and archaeological evidence demonstrates is that early Christianity was a far more complex and diverse phenomenon than might be suggested by focusing solely on the canonical texts. This complexity creates space for scholarly investigation into questions about the relationships between key figures, the preservation of alternative traditions, and the possibility that some communities maintained memories that were not incorporated into official Christianity. As we examine these various types of evidence, it's important to maintain scholarly rigor while remaining open to the possibility that our understanding of early Christian history continues to evolve as new evidence emerges and new methodological approaches are developed. Throughout history, marginalized communities have often served as repositories for traditions and memories that were excluded from official narratives. This phenomenon is particularly relevant when we examine the traditions surrounding Mary Magdalene and the possibility of her descendants. In southern France, particularly in the region around Sainte-Marie-de-la-Mer, local traditions have preserved stories about the arrival of early Christian figures following the crucifixion. These traditions, while clearly containing legendary elements, have attracted scholarly attention because they preserve details that sometimes align with independently verifiable historical information. According to these local traditions, Mary Magdalene, along with other early Christian figures, arrived in southern France and established communities that preserved particular understandings of Christian teaching. Some versions of these traditions include references to a young woman named Sarah, who was part of this group and who played a significant role in the preservation of these teachings. The academic approach to such traditions involves careful analysis of how oral histories develop and change over time. Scholars distinguish between the historical core of traditions and later elaborations. They examine how traditions migrate between different communities and how they're influenced by changing cultural and political contexts. What makes these particular traditions academically interesting is their preservation by multiple, seemingly independent communities. The Romani people, who have maintained a strong devotional tradition around Sara la Kali, claim that their veneration of this figure predates their conversion to Christianity and reflects ancient memories preserved through oral tradition. Similarly, certain Christian mystical traditions in southern France have maintained devotional practices focused on Mary Magdalene that include references to her role as a teacher and guide for subsequent generations. These traditions often emphasize the continuation of spiritual wisdom through both direct teaching and family relationships. The preservation of these traditions across different cultural groups suggests the possibility that they may reflect genuine historical memories, even if those memories have been filtered through centuries of retelling and reinterpretation. Anthropological research on oral tradition has demonstrated that communities can preserve remarkably accurate historical information across many generations, particularly when that information is considered sacred or essential to group identity. Archaeological investigations in southern France have provided some support for the plausibility of early Christian presence in the region. Evidence suggests that Christian communities were established there earlier than was previously thought, and that these communities maintained connections with Christian centers in other parts of the Mediterranean world. The traditions about Sarah are particularly intriguing because they appear to preserve specific details about her role and significance. She is consistently portrayed as a figure who bridged different communities and who possessed particular wisdom about spiritual matters. Some traditions describe her as a teacher and healer, roles that would have been significant in early Christian communities. The academic study of these traditions requires consideration of how symbolic and historical truth might intersect. Even if the traditions about Sarah don't preserve literal historical facts, they may preserve important truths about the roles that women played in early Christian communities, the ways that spiritual authority was transmitted, and the values that certain communities considered important to preserve. Here's what fascinates me about preserved traditions. They survive because they mean something profound to people. If these stories about a sacred lineage have been kept alive for centuries across different cultures and communities, what does that tell us about their emotional and spiritual truth? Share in the comments. Have you ever felt drawn to stories that seem to hold deeper meaning than their surface narrative? Your intuition might be recognizing something ancient that speaks to universal human longings for connection to the sacred. The preservation of traditions about Sarah across multiple communities also raises questions about the mechanisms by which historical memory operates. How do communities decide what to remember and what to forget? How do they adapt ancient memories to new circumstances while maintaining essential elements? Research into these questions has revealed that the preservation of tradition often involves a complex interplay between historical memory, cultural identity, and spiritual meaning. Communities preserve traditions not just because they believe them to be historically accurate, but because those traditions continue to provide meaning and guidance for contemporary life. This understanding helps explain why traditions about Mary Magdalene and Sarah have remained vital across centuries. These traditions speak to concerns about spiritual authority, the role of women in religious communities, and the preservation of authentic spiritual insight that remain relevant for contemporary seekers. The name Sarah emerges from multiple historical and cultural contexts in ways that have intrigued researchers for decades. Academic investigation into this figure requires careful analysis of how traditions develop, migrate, and preserve historical memories across different communities and time periods. In Romani tradition, Sara la Kali holds a position of particular reverence. She is venerated as a saint and protector, with annual pilgrimages to Sainte-Marie de la Mer in southern France, drawing Romani people from across Europe. What makes this tradition academically significant is its apparent antiquity and its preservation of specific details about Sarah's role and characteristics. According to Romani oral tradition, Sarah was a figure who possessed remarkable spiritual insight and who served as a bridge between different communities. She is often described as having dark skin, which has led to her designation as Sara la Negra, or Sarah the Black. This physical description appears consistently across different versions of the tradition, suggesting it may preserve genuine historical memory. The academic study of Romani traditions presents particular challenges because these communities have historically been marginalized and their oral traditions have rarely been recorded by outside observers. However, recent ethnographic research has revealed that Romani oral tradition can preserve remarkably detailed and accurate historical information across many generations. Some scholars have noted parallels between the Romani veneration of Sara la Kali and certain Gnostic traditions that reference a figure named Sarah in connection with divine wisdom and spiritual insight. While these parallels don't constitute proof of historical connection, they suggest patterns that merit further investigation. In certain medieval French traditions, references to a figure named Sarah appear in connection with Mary Magdalene and the establishment of early Christian communities in southern France. These traditions, while clearly containing legendary elements, preserve details about Sarah's role as a teacher and spiritual guide that align with independently attested information about women's roles in early Christian communities. The consistency of certain details across these different traditional contexts has attracted scholarly attention. Sarah is consistently portrayed as a figure who possessed special spiritual insight, who served as a teacher and guide, and who played a crucial role in preserving particular spiritual traditions. These characteristics align with what historians know about the roles that women often played in early religious movements. Archaeological research has provided some context for understanding how figures like Sarah might have functioned in early Christian communities. Evidence from various early Christian sites demonstrates that women held leadership positions, served as teachers and healers, and played crucial roles in the preservation and transmission of spiritual traditions. The figure of Sarah also appears in certain textual traditions that were preserved outside of canonical Christianity. Some Gnostic texts contain references to a Sarah who is associated with divine wisdom and spiritual insight. While these texts are clearly later compositions that reflect developed theological positions, they may preserve earlier traditions about historical figures. The academic approach to studying the figure of Sarah requires consideration of multiple types of evidence: oral traditions, textual references, archaeological context, and comparative analysis of how similar figures appear in other historical contexts. This multidisciplinary approach helps scholars assess the historical plausibility of traditions while acknowledging the limitations of available evidence. One of the most intriguing aspects of the Sara traditions is their preservation across communities that had limited contact with each other. The fact that Romani oral tradition, medieval French Christian texts, and certain Gnostic manuscripts all contain references to a Sara associated with early Christian history suggests the possibility of a common historical source, even if that source is now difficult to reconstruct. The name Sara itself has significance within early Christian contexts. In Hebrew tradition, Sarah was the wife of Abraham and a matriarchal figure of fundamental importance. The choice of this name for a figure associated with Mary Magdalene and early Christian tradition may reflect an understanding of continuity between Hebrew and Christian spiritual lineages. Some scholars have suggested that the figure of Sarah may represent a synthesis of historical memory and symbolic meaning. Even if Sarah was a historical figure associated with Mary Magdalene and early Christian communities, the traditions about her may have been shaped by symbolic concerns about spiritual authority, the preservation of sacred wisdom, and the continuation of divine presence in the world. The devotional traditions that have developed around Sarah also provide insight into how communities understand spiritual authority and divine presence. The continued veneration of Sarah across centuries suggests that the traditions about her continue to provide meaning and guidance for contemporary spiritual seekers. As we examine the figure of Sarah, we see how historical research can illuminate questions about early Christian diversity, the roles of women in religious communities, and the mechanisms by which spiritual traditions are preserved and transmitted across generations. The academic study of early Christian symbolism reveals a rich and complex system of meaning that often operated on multiple levels simultaneously. Understanding this symbolic language is crucial for interpreting traditions about figures like Sarah and their significance within early Christian communities. In early Christian contexts, names themselves often carried symbolic significance beyond their literal meaning. The name Sarah, deriving from Hebrew tradition, means princess or noblewoman, which would have resonated with early Christian understandings of spiritual nobility and divine inheritance. This symbolic dimension helps explain why the name might have been chosen for a figure associated with the preservation of sacred lineage. The figure of Sarah appears in artistic and symbolic contexts that suggest sophisticated understanding of spiritual symbolism. In some medieval artistic traditions, Sarah is depicted with symbols associated with divine wisdom, books representing preserved knowledge, roses representing spiritual love, and dark coloring that may represent the hidden or mystical dimensions of spiritual truth. Academic research into early Christian symbolism has revealed that these communities often used visual and narrative symbols to communicate complex theological concepts. The color black, for instance, was often associated with the hidden or mystical aspects of divine truth, which may help explain Sarah's designation as Sarah the Black beyond any literal physical description. The rose symbol, which appears frequently in connection with both Mary Magdalene and Sarah, carried particular significance in early Christian symbolic systems. Roses represented divine love, spiritual marriage, and the unfolding of sacred wisdom. The association of this symbol with both Mary Magdalene and Sarah suggests their connection to these fundamental spiritual concepts. Archaeological discoveries have provided material evidence for the sophistication of early Christian symbolic systems. Artifacts found at early Christian sites demonstrate that these communities used complex symbolic languages to communicate spiritual concepts and to identify members of their communities. This symbolic sophistication suggests that the traditions about Sarah may operate on symbolic as well as historical levels. The academic study of these symbolic systems requires understanding of how meaning is encoded and transmitted through various media: visual art, narrative traditions, ritual practices, and architectural forms. Scholars examine how symbols acquire meaning within particular cultural contexts and how they evolve as they move between different communities. In the case of Sarah, several symbolic patterns emerge across different traditional contexts. She is consistently associated with wisdom, teaching, and the preservation of sacred knowledge. These associations align with broader patterns in how early Christian communities understood spiritual authority and the transmission of divine truth. The symbolic language surrounding Sarah also reflects early Christian understandings of how divine presence operates in the world. She is often portrayed as a figure who mediates between different realms, human and divine, visible and hidden, present and future. This mediating role reflects sophisticated theological concepts about how spiritual truth is communicated and preserved. Some scholars have noted that the symbolic patterns associated with Sarah align with broader Mediterranean traditions about sacred feminine figures who preserve and transmit divine wisdom. This alignment suggests that the traditions about Sarah may draw on symbolic resources that extend beyond specifically Christian contexts. The geographic symbolism associated with Sarah is also significant. Her connection to southern France, a region that served as a crossroads between different cultures and spiritual traditions, may reflect understanding of how spiritual wisdom is preserved and transmitted through geographic as well as temporal migration. Academic analysis of symbolic patterns often reveals layers of meaning that may not be immediately apparent. The traditions about Sarah appear to operate simultaneously as historical memory, theological statement, and spiritual guidance. This multiplicity of meaning helps explain their persistence across different communities and time periods. The study of early Christian symbolism also illuminates how communities understood the relationship between historical truth and spiritual truth. For early Christian communities, historical accuracy was often less important than spiritual authenticity. The traditions about Sarah may preserve spiritual truths about the nature of divine wisdom and its preservation, even if they don't provide literal historical information. The symbolic dimensions of the Sarah traditions also help explain their appeal to different types of communities. The symbols associated with her speak to universal human concerns about spiritual authority, the preservation of sacred wisdom, and the continuation of divine presence in the world. Modern scholarly approaches to symbolism recognize that symbols can carry multiple meanings simultaneously, and that their significance may change as they move between different cultural contexts. This understanding helps explain how the figure of Sarah could maintain significance across very different communities while adapting to their particular spiritual and cultural needs. The academic study of these symbolic patterns provides insight not only into early Christian history, but also into how spiritual traditions develop and maintain relevance across time. The symbols associated with Sarah continue to resonate with contemporary spiritual seekers, suggesting that they address enduring human concerns about meaning, purpose, and connection to the sacred. As we examine the symbolic dimensions of the Sarah traditions, we gain deeper appreciation for the sophistication of early Christian spiritual thought and the mechanisms by which spiritual wisdom is preserved and transmitted across generations. Understanding the historical development of institutional Christianity requires examination of how official church structures emerged and how they related to alternative traditions and communities. This historical context is essential for understanding why certain traditions about figures like Sarah might have been preserved outside of official channels. The process of Christian institutionalization was gradual and complex, involving decisions about which texts to include in the biblical canon, which theological positions to endorse officially, and which practices to encourage or discourage. Academic research has revealed that this process involved political as well as theological considerations. During the early centuries of Christianity, multiple communities existed with different understandings of key figures and events. Some communities emphasized the role of Mary Magdalene as a teacher and spiritual authority, while others focused more on the authority of male apostles like Peter. These different emphases reflected different theological and social priorities. The formation of the biblical canon involved complex decisions about which texts were considered authoritative and which were excluded. Scholars have demonstrated that these decisions were influenced by various factors: theological concerns, political considerations, and practical issues about which texts were widely accepted by different communities. The exclusion of certain texts from the biblical canon doesn't necessarily reflect judgments about their historical accuracy or spiritual value. Many texts were excluded because they represented theological positions that differed from emerging Orthodox consensus, or because they were associated with communities that were considered marginal or problematic by institutional authorities. This historical context helps explain why traditions about Mary Magdalene and Sarah might have been preserved by communities that existed on the margins of institutional Christianity. These communities may have maintained traditions that were less acceptable to official authorities, but that preserved important aspects of early Christian diversity. The academic study of this institutionalization process reveals that it was neither uniform nor complete. Different regions developed different approaches to Christian practice and belief, and alternative traditions continued to exist alongside official Christianity. This ongoing diversity created space for the preservation of traditions that might otherwise have been lost. Archaeological evidence supports this understanding of early Christian diversity. Excavations at various early Christian sites have revealed different approaches to religious practice, different roles for women in religious communities, and different understandings of spiritual authority. This material evidence complements textual evidence for the diversity of early Christianity. The relationship between institutional Christianity and alternative traditions was complex and varied over time. Periods of greater tolerance alternated with periods of more aggressive suppression of alternative viewpoints. Some traditions were gradually incorporated into official Christianity, while others were preserved by communities that maintained their independence from institutional authority. The preservation of traditions about Sarah and Mary Magdalene by communities like the Romani people may reflect this dynamic. These communities maintained their cultural independence while also engaging with Christian tradition, creating space for the preservation of alternative understandings and practices. Academic research has also revealed that the suppression of alternative traditions was often incomplete. Even when official authorities attempted to eliminate certain practices or beliefs, they often survived in modified forms or in marginal communities. This pattern helps explain how traditions about figures like Sarah could persist across centuries, despite lack of official endorsement. The study of institutional resistance to alternative traditions also illuminates broader questions about religious authority and the preservation of spiritual diversity. The tension between institutional control and alternative spiritual insight appears to be a recurring pattern in religious history. Modern scholarship approaches these questions with recognition that institutional and alternative traditions often preserve different but complementary aspects of spiritual truth. Rather than viewing them as simply conflicting, scholars examine how they represent different approaches to understanding and preserving sacred wisdom. The historical context of institutional development also helps explain why questions about Mary Magdalene and Sarah have attracted renewed interest in contemporary times. As religious institutions have become more open to diverse perspectives, and as historical research has revealed the complexity of early Christianity, space has been created for reconsideration of traditions that were previously marginalized. The academic approach to these questions requires careful analysis of how institutional priorities influence the preservation and transmission of historical memory. Scholars examine how political and social concerns shaped religious decision-making and how alternative communities responded to institutional pressure. This historical understanding provides context for evaluating traditions about Sarah without falling into simple conspiracy theories or anti-institutional bias. The preservation of alternative traditions reflects natural processes of social and religious development rather than deliberate suppression of truth. As we examine these institutional dynamics, we gain deeper appreciation for the complexity of early Christian history and the various factors that influenced which traditions were preserved through official channels and which were maintained by alternative communities. The traditions surrounding Sarah and Mary Magdalene demonstrate remarkable geographic and cultural distribution, appearing in various forms across different continents and cultural contexts. This global dimension provides important perspective on how spiritual traditions migrate and adapt while maintaining essential elements. Academic research into the global distribution of these traditions reveals patterns that suggest ancient networks of communication and migration. The appearance of similar motifs in European, Middle Eastern, and North African contexts indicates that early Christian communities maintained connections across vast geographic distances. In various Mediterranean cultures, traditions exist about powerful spiritual women who preserved sacred wisdom and served as bridges between different communities. While these traditions have different names and specific details, they share remarkable structural similarities that suggest common origins or extensive cultural exchange. The Romani preservation of Saralakali traditions is particularly significant because the Romani people migrated across multiple continents while maintaining their cultural and spiritual traditions. Their preservation of specific details about Sara across this geographic dispersion provides a unique window into how oral traditions can maintain consistency across time and distance. Archaeological evidence supports the understanding that early Christian communities were internationally connected. Trade routes, migration patterns, and political connections created networks through which people, ideas, and traditions could travel across vast distances. These networks help explain how traditions about Mary Magdalene and Sarah could appear in multiple, seemingly disconnected locations. Comparative religious studies have revealed that many cultures have traditions about sacred feminine figures who preserve divine wisdom and spiritual lineages. While these traditions have different specific details, their structural similarities suggest they may address universal human concerns about spiritual authority and the preservation of sacred knowledge. The global perspective also illuminates how different cultures have understood and preserved the figure of Sarah. In some contexts, she appears as a historical figure with specific biographical details. In others, she functions more as a symbolic representation of spiritual principles. This variety suggests that the traditions about her have been flexible enough to meet different cultural and spiritual needs. Academic analysis of global migration patterns provides context for understanding how early Christian figures might have traveled to various parts of the world. Research into ancient trade routes, refugee movements, and missionary activities reveals that extensive travel was more common in the ancient world than might be expected. The study of how traditions adapt to different cultural contexts provides insight into the mechanisms by which spiritual wisdom is preserved and transmitted. Traditions about Sarah have shown remarkable ability to maintain essential elements while adapting to different languages, cultures, and spiritual contexts. Cross-cultural comparison also reveals how different societies have understood the relationship between historical truth and spiritual meaning. Some cultures emphasize the historical accuracy of traditions about Sarah, while others focus more on their spiritual and symbolic significance. This variety suggests different approaches to understanding how sacred truth operates. As we explore these universal themes that appear across cultures, I'm curious, from which part of the world are you watching this? It's remarkable how these ancient narratives about sacred lineage and hidden wisdom appear in traditions from Europe to the Americas, from Africa to Asia, often with strikingly similar elements. Drop your location in the comments. Let's see how global this interest in hidden spiritual heritage really is. The patterns we're discovering suggest these traditions speak to something universal in human spiritual experience. The global distribution of Sarah traditions also provides perspective on how marginalized communities have preserved alternative historical narratives. The fact that similar traditions appear among different marginalized groups across multiple continents suggests they may serve important functions in maintaining cultural identity and spiritual autonomy. Modern communication technologies have created new opportunities for comparing and analyzing these global traditions. Scholars can now examine patterns across cultures that were previously difficult to study due to geographic and linguistic barriers. This comparative approach has revealed both the diversity and the underlying unity of traditions about Sarah and Mary Magdalene. The global perspective ultimately enriches our understanding of how spiritual traditions develop and maintain relevance across time and culture. The widespread appeal of traditions about Sarah suggests they address enduring human concerns about spiritual authority, the preservation of sacred wisdom, and the continuation of divine presence in the world. Modern scholarly approaches to the traditions surrounding Sarah and Mary Magdalene reflect sophisticated methodological developments in multiple academic disciplines. Contemporary researchers bring tools from archaeology, anthropology, linguistics, and religious studies to bear on these ancient questions. Recent archaeological discoveries have provided new context for understanding early Christian diversity and the roles that women played in early Christian communities. Excavations at sites across the Mediterranean world have revealed evidence for women's leadership in early Christian communities, sophisticated systems of theological education, and extensive networks of communication between different Christian centers. These archaeological findings complement textual discoveries like the Nag Hammadi Library and provide material evidence for the complexity of early Christianity. The picture that emerges from this combined evidence suggests that early Christian communities were far more diverse in their practices and beliefs than traditional historical narratives indicated. Contemporary gender studies have brought new analytical tools to the study of figures like Mary Magdalene and Sarah. These approaches examine how gender roles were constructed and contested in early Christian communities, how women's spiritual authority was understood and exercised, and how traditions about powerful spiritual women have been preserved and transmitted. The application of anthropological methods to the study of oral tradition has revolutionized understanding of how historical memory operates in non-literate communities. Research has demonstrated that oral traditions can preserve remarkably accurate historical information across many generations, particularly when that information is considered sacred or essential to community identity. These methodological developments have important implications for evaluating traditions about Sarah. Rather than dismissing oral traditions as inherently unreliable, contemporary scholars examine them as potential sources of historical information while acknowledging their limitations and the ways they may be influenced by later developments. Digital humanities approaches have created new possibilities for analyzing patterns across large collections of texts and traditions. Computer-assisted analysis can identify linguistic patterns, trace the development of motifs across different sources, and map the geographic distribution of traditions in ways that were previously impossible. Contemporary biblical scholarship has also evolved to recognize the importance of non-canonical sources for understanding early Christianity. The artificial distinction between canonical and apocryphal texts is increasingly understood as reflecting later institutional decisions rather than judgments about historical value or spiritual authenticity. Modern psychological approaches to religious experience provide insight into why traditions about figures like Sarah have maintained their appeal across centuries. Research into the psychology of religious experience suggests that narratives about hidden wisdom, sacred lineages, and preserved truth address fundamental human needs for meaning, connection, and spiritual authenticity. The contemporary academic approach to these questions also reflects greater sensitivity to issues of cultural diversity and marginalized voices. Scholars increasingly recognize that historical narratives have often been constructed from the perspectives of dominant groups, and that alternative voices may preserve important aspects of historical truth. This methodological evolution has created space for serious academic consideration of traditions that were previously dismissed or ignored. The traditions about Sarah, preserved by marginalized communities like the Romani people, are now understood as potentially valuable sources of historical information rather than mere folklore. Contemporary interfaith dialogue has also influenced how scholars approach these questions. Rather than viewing different religious traditions as competing truth claims, many scholars now examine how different traditions may preserve complementary aspects of spiritual and historical truth. The rise of feminist theology and scholarship has brought particular attention to figures like Mary Magdalene and Sarah. These approaches examine how women's spiritual authority was understood in early Christianity and how traditions about powerful spiritual women have been preserved despite institutional marginalization. Modern archaeological techniques have provided unprecedented insight into the material culture of early Christian communities. Isotope analysis can trace migration patterns, DNA analysis can provide information about population movements, and improved dating techniques can establish more precise chronologies for early Christian developments. These technological advances have particular relevance for evaluating traditions about early Christian figures who may have traveled to different parts of the Mediterranean world. While these techniques cannot prove specific traditions about Mary Magdalene or Sarah, they can provide context for understanding how such migrations might have occurred. Contemporary religious studies also brings comparative perspective to these questions. Analysis of how spiritual traditions develop and change across different cultures provides models for understanding how traditions about Sarah might have evolved while preserving essential elements. The modern academic approach to these questions emphasizes the importance of methodological rigor while remaining open to new evidence and interpretative possibilities. This approach recognizes that historical understanding continues to evolve as new evidence emerges and new analytical tools are developed. Contemporary scholars also bring greater awareness of how their own cultural and religious backgrounds influence their interpretative approaches. This methodological self-consciousness helps ensure that academic investigation of these questions remains as objective as possible while acknowledging the limitations of complete objectivity. The current academic consensus recognizes that questions about Mary Magdalene and Sarah cannot be answered with absolute certainty based on available evidence. However, this uncertainty doesn't invalidate scholarly investigation of these questions. Instead, it emphasizes the importance of careful methodology and appropriate humility about the limitations of historical knowledge. Modern approaches to these questions also recognize the difference between historical investigation and religious faith. Academic research can examine the historical plausibility of traditions and analyze their development over time, but it cannot determine their ultimate truth or significance for contemporary spiritual seekers. The contemporary academic approach ultimately enriches, rather than threatens, religious understanding by providing deeper insight into the complexity and diversity of early Christianity. This research reveals a rich tradition of spiritual exploration and preservation that continues to offer resources for contemporary spiritual development. Beyond the historical and academic dimensions of traditions about Sarah lies a profound set of spiritual questions that have engaged seekers across centuries. These traditions speak to fundamental concerns about spiritual authority, the preservation of sacred wisdom, and the ways that divine truth manifests in human history. The figure of Sarah, whether understood as a historical person or a symbolic representation, embodies important spiritual principles that transcend specific historical claims. She represents the preservation of sacred wisdom across generations, the courage to maintain truth in the face of opposition, and the possibility that divine insight can be transmitted through various channels. For many contemporary spiritual seekers, the traditions about Sarah address concerns about spiritual authenticity and the preservation of genuine wisdom traditions. In an era when many people feel disconnected from institutional religious authority, the figure of Sarah represents alternative sources of spiritual guidance and insight. The emphasis on oral tradition and community preservation in the Sarah traditions speaks to different ways of understanding how spiritual truth is transmitted. Rather than relying solely on written texts or institutional authority, these traditions suggest that spiritual wisdom can be preserved through community practice, lived experience, and direct transmission from teacher to student. The association of Sarah with marginalized communities also carries important spiritual implications. Throughout history, marginalized groups have often preserved spiritual insights that were overlooked or suppressed by dominant institutions. The preservation of Sarah traditions by communities like the Romani people suggests that spiritual truth may be found in unexpected places. The figure of Sarah also embodies the principle of spiritual bridge building. She is consistently portrayed as a figure who connected different communities and who helped preserve communication between diverse groups. This mediating role speaks to contemporary concerns about building understanding across different spiritual traditions. For women seeking spiritual empowerment, the traditions about Sarah provide powerful examples of female spiritual authority and wisdom. These traditions suggest that women have always played crucial roles in preserving and transmitting spiritual insight, even when their contributions were not officially recognized. The emphasis on hidden or preserved wisdom in the Sarah traditions addresses contemporary concerns about spiritual depth and authenticity. Many seekers feel that conventional religious approaches lack the depth and mystery that they associate with genuine spiritual truth. The traditions about Sarah suggest that deeper wisdom may be available to those who seek it seriously. The geographic dispersion of Sarah traditions also speaks to universal spiritual concerns. The fact that similar motifs appear across different cultures suggests that these traditions address fundamental human needs for connection to the sacred that transcend specific cultural or religious boundaries. The preservation of Sarah traditions across centuries of persecution and marginalization demonstrates the power of spiritual conviction to overcome external obstacles. These traditions suggest that genuine spiritual insight has an inherent power to survive and flourish, even under difficult circumstances. For communities that feel marginalized or overlooked by mainstream religious institutions, the Sarah traditions provide examples of how spiritual truth can be preserved and maintained outside of official channels. These traditions suggest that spiritual authority doesn't depend solely on institutional recognition. The emphasis on family lineage and spiritual inheritance in some Sarah traditions speaks to concerns about spiritual continuity and the transmission of sacred wisdom across generations. These traditions suggest that spiritual truth can be preserved through various means, including family relationships and community practices. The mystical dimensions of the Sarah traditions address contemporary interests in direct spiritual experience and personal transformation. Rather than emphasizing doctrine or belief, these traditions focus on lived spiritual experience and the possibility of direct encounter with sacred truth. The association of Sarah with divine wisdom and spiritual insight speaks to contemporary concerns about the relationship between knowledge and wisdom. In an era of information overload, many seekers are looking for sources of genuine wisdom that can provide guidance for living meaningful lives. The figure of Sarah also embodies the principle of spiritual courage. She is consistently portrayed as someone who maintained spiritual truth despite opposition and who continued teaching and guiding others even in difficult circumstances. This example speaks to contemporary seekers who may face challenges in maintaining their spiritual convictions. The traditions about Sarah suggest that spiritual truth has many dimensions and can be approached through various paths. Historical accuracy, symbolic meaning, and lived spiritual experience all contribute to the significance of these traditions for contemporary seekers. The emphasis on preservation and transmission in the Sarah traditions speaks to contemporary concerns about spiritual continuity. Many seekers worry that genuine spiritual wisdom is being lost in modern society. The Sarah traditions suggest that spiritual truth has inherent power to preserve itself across time and cultural change. The community emphasis in Sarah traditions addresses contemporary concerns about spiritual isolation. These traditions suggest that spiritual development occurs within community contexts and that individual spiritual growth is enhanced by connection with others who share similar spiritual concerns. The Sarah traditions also speak to contemporary interests in the relationship between the sacred feminine and spiritual development. These traditions suggest that feminine spiritual principles play essential roles in spiritual development and the preservation of sacred wisdom. For those interested in alternative approaches to Christian spirituality, the Sarah traditions provide examples of how Christian insight can be understood and practiced outside of conventional institutional frameworks. These traditions suggest that Christian spiritual truth can take many forms and can be preserved through various means. The ultimate spiritual significance of the Sarah traditions may lie not in their historical accuracy, but in their capacity to inspire contemporary spiritual development. These traditions provide models for spiritual courage, wisdom preservation, and community building that remain relevant for modern seekers. The traditions about Sarah ultimately point toward the possibility that sacred truth manifests in unexpected ways and through unlikely channels. They suggest that spiritual seekers should remain open to wisdom from various sources and should not limit their spiritual exploration to conventional or officially sanctioned approaches. As we draw together the various threads of evidence and analysis we've explored, several significant patterns emerge that illuminate both the historical questions surrounding Sarah and the broader dynamics of how spiritual traditions develop and survive. The convergence of multiple independent sources, manuscript traditions, oral histories, archaeological contexts, and cultural practices, pointing toward a figure named Sarah associated with Mary Magdalene and early Christian communities, suggests that this tradition may preserve genuine historical memory, even if specific details remain difficult to verify with absolute certainty. The consistency of certain characteristics across different traditional contexts, Sarah as teacher, bridge builder, wisdom keeper, and preserver of sacred lineages, indicates either common historical origins or the operation of universal spiritual principles that transcend specific historical circumstances. The preservation of Sarah traditions by marginalized communities across different geographic regions demonstrates the power of spiritual conviction to maintain truth claims outside of official institutional channels. This preservation pattern suggests that these traditions served important functions for the communities that maintained them. The academic methodologies we've examined, from manuscript analysis to anthropological study of oral tradition, provide tools for evaluating these traditions while acknowledging their limitations. Contemporary scholarship suggests that these traditions deserve serious consideration as potential sources of historical information, even if they cannot be verified with complete certainty. The symbolic dimensions of the Sarah traditions reveal sophisticated understanding of spiritual principles that remain relevant for contemporary seekers. Whether understood as historical fact or spiritual metaphor, these traditions address fundamental concerns about spiritual authority, wisdom preservation, and the continuation of divine presence in human history. The global distribution of Sarah traditions suggests that they address universal human concerns that transcend specific cultural or religious boundaries. The appeal of these traditions across different cultures indicates their capacity to speak to enduring spiritual needs. The contemporary relevance of these traditions lies not only in their historical significance, but in their capacity to provide models for spiritual development, community building, and the preservation of authentic spiritual insight. They suggest alternative approaches to understanding spiritual authority and wisdom transmission. The tension between institutional and alternative traditions, reflected in the Sarah narratives, illuminates broader questions about religious authority and the preservation of spiritual diversity. These traditions suggest that spiritual truth can be preserved through various channels and may emerge from unexpected sources. The emphasis on feminine spiritual authority in the Sarah traditions provides important balance to male-dominated historical narratives and suggests that women have always played crucial roles in spiritual development and wisdom preservation, even when their contributions were not officially recognized. Ultimately, the traditions about Sarah point toward a more complex and diverse understanding of early Christian history than conventional narratives suggest. They reveal a rich tradition of spiritual exploration and preservation that continues to offer resources for contemporary spiritual development. Whether Sarah was a historical figure, a symbolic representation, or some combination of both, the traditions about her demonstrate the human capacity to preserve and transmit spiritual wisdom across generations and cultural boundaries. They suggest that spiritual truth has inherent power to survive and flourish even under challenging circumstances. The question we began with tonight, what name was given to the alleged daughter of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, has led us through a complex landscape of historical evidence, preserved traditions, and spiritual insight. While we may not have arrived at definitive historical proof, we have discovered something equally valuable, a rich tradition of spiritual exploration that continues to offer wisdom for contemporary seekers. The name Sarah emerges from this investigation not merely as a historical curiosity, but as a symbol of the human capacity to preserve sacred wisdom across time and cultural boundaries. Whether understood as literal history or spiritual metaphor, the traditions about Sarah speak to enduring concerns about spiritual authenticity, the preservation of truth, and the possibility that divine insight can be transmitted through unexpected channels. The academic approaches we've examined provide tools for continued investigation while acknowledging the limitations of historical knowledge. The spiritual dimensions of these traditions offer resources for personal and community development that transcend specific historical claims. Whether these traditions preserve historical truth or represent powerful spiritual metaphors, they invite us to deepen our understanding of our spiritual heritage and to remain open to wisdom from unexpected sources. If this exploration has resonated with you and expanded your perspective on early Christian history and spiritual development, subscribe to continue this scholarly journey together. Click on the next video that appears on your screen. We'll continue examining questions that have intrigued serious researchers and spiritual seekers for generations. Thank you for watching this video until the end. See you in the next video.